the colonial history of South Carolina. And started basically with first contact with the Native American tribes in 1524 when Lucas Vasquez de Ayllons sailed into Winyah Bay, which is where Georgetown is. And he promptly captured 60 Winyah Indians and took them into slavery in the Caribbean. And that was the introduction of the Native Americans to European culture. And one thing I'm always fond of saying is the Spaniards could not have been worse ambassadors for European culture. De Ayllon came back in 1526 with a 600 colonists settled somewhere along the East Coast. Within 6 months, 500 of those colonists were dead, including de Ayllon, and that was primarily due to smallpox. At first contact, there were 10 million Native Americans in North America. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there were 1 million Native Americans. So there was 90% loss due to European diseases. There was a war with the British colonists and the Native American tribes, the Yamasee War in 1715. It was a very confusing time. The Cherokees were enemies at one time. They were allies at another. The Catawbas and the Cherokees, which were always bitter enemies. If the Cherokees were allies, the Catawbas was enemies, and vice versa. So there was always that conflict going on. Plus the Cherokees were perennial enemies with the Creeks as well, who were in Georgia. So in 1739, there was a slave revolt. This is the Stono Revolt. It's the only slave revolt that occurred in South Carolina, but it had a huge impact, and it was something that the colonists and actually the slave owners from there on out really were on the lookout for, and that was high on their list of priorities to keep under control is slave revolts. French and Indian War happened 1754 to 1761 is the 7 Years' War in Europe. 1755 to 1763 is the French and Indian War in America. As a result of that French and Indian War, France was pushed out of North America. Florida became English, Louisiana became Spanish, Canada became English. And there was a terrible misunderstanding between the Cherokees and the British at that time, which led to the Anglo-Cherokee War, or the First Cherokee War, in 1758 to 1761, when the British finally destroyed Cherokee settlements in South Carolina and western North Carolina. Now, they were rebuilt by the time of the Revolutionary War, but the conflict with the Cherokees was of primary concern to the colonial settlers throughout the period of the Revolutionary War. And then we had the Regulators movement in the 1760s. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that later on. The backcountry of South Carolina, where we are right now, the backcountry was the frontier of America during this time, 1755 to 1775. This was absolutely unsettled virgin territory. And some of the best people in the world moved into this area. Some of the worst people in the world moved into this area. And as a result of that, the regulator movement arose. It was a vigilante movement. The legal system based in Charleston was not up to the task of keeping peace in the backcountry. So the regulators took matters into their own hands. Like I say, there were vigilantes. If they felt that there was a horse thief on the loose, they would capture that horse thief, tie him to a tree, whip him till they felt he was punished appropriately, and let him go. So that's great for people who really were horse thieves. But as every vigilante movement inevitably does, it got out of hand. And in opposition to the regulators, the moderators arose. And many of our future leaders in the Revolutionary War were on both sides of this conflict, regulators versus moderators. But basically that leads us up to the time period when the Revolutionary War does begin. And several factors come into play. One of the factors that came into play is this line right here. This is the Continental Divide. This is also the proclamation line of 1763. In 1763, the king made a promise to the Native Americans saying that there will never be European settlement beyond this line. Well, that was fine with the folks in England, but it wasn't too fine with the folks in western Pennsylvania and western North Carolina, Virginia, and so forth. So this is one of the reasons for the conflicts. This is one of the reasons that the Native Americans were allied with the British forces, because they did not want European settlement beyond this line. Now, if you look, I mean, these states weren't fully developed. Georgia, this shows half of Georgia being Native American territory. There was only about a third of Georgia that was settled. There were only 2 towns in Georgia, Savannah and Augusta. This shows the 13 colonies. There were actually 25 colonies that England had in North America. There were 5 in Canada. There was East Florida with the capital of St. Augustine. There was West Florida with the capital of Pensacola. And there were 5 Caribbean colonies. So only half the colonies that England had were in rebellion. England, their policy was to deal with each individual colony separately. They had policies that were specifically geared towards Massachusetts. And then they would have South Carolina policies and Florida policies. That is why it's so important when we think about the United States. England did not want us to be united. They liked dealing with each colony individually. They had more control that way. A movement arose that the colonies would work as a group, that the colonies would associate, and they were referred to as the Associators. So the oath of association was one thing that the colonists liked to have folks sign, because that showed that we were unified against England. So the Revolutionary War started in Massachusetts. It started in Boston. There's no question about it. That is where the oppressive rule of the British government was at its strongest. We know about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Can anybody here tell me what the Third Amendment is? We don't have any lawyers in the room. Even lawyers don't know this. The Third Amendment is the Quartering Act. It is illegal for any army to quarter their soldiers in private homes because of the Third Amendment. Well, the British, that's what they were doing in Boston. There were 4,000 British soldiers who were forced into the homes in Boston, living with the colonists there, eating their food, sleeping in the beds or what have you. So that's just one example of the oppressiveness of the British government in England, or excuse me, in New England and in Boston in particular. So Yes, we know that's where it started. We know about Lexington and Concord in March of 1775. And we know about Bunker Hill in June of 1775. The British, there were two hills that overlooked Boston Harbor. One of them was Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill. And the American Army set up on Bunker Hill overlooking the harbor down below. Well, the British didn't like that, so they attacked the colonists that were, or the Americans on Bunker Hill. And wave after wave of British forces went up against those entrenched positions. And there was 1/3 of the British who attacking force were casualties as a result of that. There were 1,000 casualties out of a 3,000 man attacking force. The only reason that the Patriots lost that battle is they ran out of ammunition. So then the British stayed dominant in Bunker Hill, but they never fortified Dorchester Hill, which was on the other side of the harbor and was equally as imposing over the harbor as Bunker Hill was. Now, one thing that's kind of surprising to me is as much activity as happened in the North, very little of that had an impact on what was happening in the South. It was almost like there was two different wars going on, and to some regards, there really were. There were 4 campaigns in the North. There was the Siege of Boston. You know, after the British took dominance in Boston, they were besieged for 10 months by George Washington and his army. And that siege was broken when the guns from Ticonderoga came over with Henry Knox. He took those guns hundreds of miles over frozen lakes and so forth, and overnight set them up on Dorchester Hill. And in one night, and the British looked up and all of a sudden they saw those cannons pointing down at them and like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now? You know, let's go. They left as a result of that. So it was the Boston campaign was the first campaign. During these campaigns overlapped, but there was the Canadian campaign where we took Montreal and we almost took Quebec with Daniel Morgan, but there was some miscommunication there and Daniel Morgan got captured and the invasion of Canada failed as a result of that. As a result of the Johnny Burgoyne and his army came into Quebec, 7,000 strong, and so the British had an army in Quebec. When the British left Boston, they sailed up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. That was a staging ground for them throughout the war. Their ships would come over, they would gather in Halifax, and then they would go wherever it was they were going to go. From Halifax, the British attacked and captured New York. George Washington fought 4 battles in New York. George Washington lost 4 battles in New York. And the British captured the New York harbor, and they stayed there till 1783. While George Washington lost the city, he kept his army. And that was important. That's an important concept to keep in mind throughout the discussion of the Revolutionary War. Next, William Howe decided that he was going to take Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States at that time. So George Washington fought 3 battles trying to keep William Howe out of Philadelphia. George Washington lost those 3 battles. He's lost 7 battles, major battles, in a row now. And as a result of that, he went to Valley Forge to regroup for the wintertime. and the British were in Philadelphia. Well, there was supposed to be a plan with Burgoyne coming down from Quebec, coming down through to join up with Howe, and there was a third group that was supposed to meet as well, and they were going to cut off New England from the rest of the United States. Except that rather than Howe joining up with Burgoyne about through here, he decides to go to Philadelphia. And the third group that was supposed to join up with Burgoyne, they never got started either. So all of a sudden, Burgoyne is by himself going through the hinterland of New York. And he is met by an army under the leadership or ultimate command of Horatio Gates. And Horatio Gates was very fortunate in having the two best field generals in the Revolution serving under him. And these field generals were Daniel Morgan and Benedict Arnold. And there were two battles that were fought, Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. These battles were fought 2 weeks apart. They were relatively inconsequential battles. They were stalemates, except that Burgoyne was just out in the wilderness, cut off from his supplies. His communications were cut off. He couldn't feed his army. He couldn't get more shot and powder. He was surrounded. And as a result of that, finally, Burgoyne had to surrender 6,500 men. This is Saratoga. Excuse me. So I talked about how what was happening in the North really had little effect on what was happening in the South. As a matter of fact, Virginia right here, there was no activity in Virginia during the Revolutionary War, in the Western Virginia. That is where the prison camps were for the Patriot forces. That is also where the supplies, the forage, the horses were used to supply the American forces because it was not overrun at any time. So it's almost like there was a no man's land right here. All this activity in the North, all this activity in the South, no activity right here. But as little effect as many of these battles had from north to south, Saratoga had a huge effect. And Saratoga is considered to be the most important battle, the biggest victory of the Patriots during the Revolutionary War. And the primary reason for that is France joined forces with us at that time. Now, before the coronavirus hit, I had prepared a lecture on the World War effects of the American Revolution. And I titled that lecture World War Zero. But everybody in the world, except for the German principalities, everybody in the world hated England at this time. The British, the Dutch, the French, they would do anything they could to harm British interest. And once Saratoga occurred, then the French came on in full force. And what that caused the British to do, William Howe is in Philadelphia and he's got 12,000 soldiers there. Well, the king tells him, look, the French are involved now. You need to take 5,000 of those men and put them in New York. And you need to take another 5,000 and put them in the Caribbean. And the 2,000 that are left over, I want you to send them down to Pensacola. Because there was a huge threat from Spain in New Orleans. And actually, the biggest land battle in the South happened in 1782 when Bernardo de Galvez, Galveston, Texas is named after him. Bernardo de Galvez took 8,000 men and attacked those 2,000 British down there in Pensacola. And that was about a 6-week siege, and the Spaniards were successful. There were only 200 Americans in that battle, biggest land battle in the South, 200 Americans involved. And that was 200 loyalists were there. So it just helped an awful lot when France entered the war. After, and now as Howe is retreating from Pennsylvania, and Washington is in Valley Forge, Howe is crossing the Delaware River. And this is in June of 1777. And Washington knows that he's crossing the river. And these river crossings are so important throughout the entire Revolutionary War, especially if you can catch somebody with half their force on one side of the river and the other half on this side. So Washington knew that was what the situation is, and he had a golden opportunity to decimate half of Howe's army. So he attacked, and he put one of his generals, the most experienced general in the American army, Charles Lee, he put him in charge of the left flank to attack and cut off Howe as he was crossing the river. And Lee charged, the rest of them charged, and the British were retreating. It was right on the verge of a great victory. And Charles Lee changes his mind, and he decides to retreat. And as a result of that, he got court-martialed over that. As a result of that, the British got away. This is the Battle of Monmouth. And the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1777 is the last offensive maneuver by the British forces in North America, other than just some skirmishes. There were no more battles in the North after the Battle of Monmouth. And of course, you know about the Southern campaigns. You know, they took Savannah in 1778, December of 1778, took Charleston in May of 1780. And we're going to talk at length about the Southern campaigns. But just to give some perspective about what was happening here in the South versus what was happening with the rest of the United States as well. And there's some other things that I want to talk about now as far as perspective is concerned. So you're kind of, for one, you can follow me because I'm just talk about these different, I'm going to explain some of the terms that I use and why I use them. So you'll hear me talk about patriots quite a bit. Of course, you know those are the American forces, and we all know what we're talking about when we say patriots. But patriot was really a term that the soldiers did not use. They did not call themselves patriots. That word came into use about 30 years after the war when the newspaper started talking about it and so forth. Now it was used. George Washington, I know there's 4 different cases in his letters where he used the word patriot. It was used, but the most common term that was used were Whigs. And the Whigs and the Tories were 2 parties in England, and some of the English politics, you know, applied in America and so forth. In England, the Whigs believed in a monarchy, but they believed in a constitutional monarchy. And the Tories, they believed in a monarchy, but they believed in an absolute monarchy. So that's one of the biggest things to realize as far as why we were fighting the Revolutionary War and how far we've come. I mean, you've got an absolute king who the church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, says the only way for you to get to heaven is to follow the king. And if you argue with the king or you don't follow the king, you're going to hell. So that was a big, big difference. The Presbyterians and the Baptists, they felt like God dealt with each person individually, and you did not have to go through a king. but the king kind of had the same relevance as a pope did during this time. So that's, one of the reasons for the differences there. But the terms that were used back then, Whigs was the most common. The second most common term was rebels, and they were called associators, and they were called rogues. They didn't have that great of an identity. People who supported the king were called kingsmen, or they were called loyalists. And if they were particularly bad loyalists, they were called Tories. So I use the term quite frequently patriot because people know what I'm talking about. And then you'll hear me talk about loyalists, and they're just the enemy. But if I say Tory, then you know he's a really bad loyalist. Other factors that come into play in understanding what happened with the Revolutionary War is understanding the weaponry that was involved. And this was really the primitiveness of the Revolutionary War is one thing that is striking. These weapons were primitive. The British Army used the Brown Bess musket. It had a 3/4 inch bore, 75 caliber. It weighed 10 pounds. It took 20 seconds to load a Brown Bess musket. You had to pour the motor, you had to run, and you had to do this, and it took 20 seconds. Now, if somebody's 100 yards away from you and you're spending 20 seconds loading your gun, he's going to be on you in no time. A man can cover 100 yards in 20 seconds. And the Brown Bess musket was notoriously inaccurate. You couldn't even try to hit a target more than 80 yards away. Round ball in a round musket barrel. And when that ball left the musket barrel, it was like a knuckleball going through the air. If you aim at this guy, you may shoot this guy in the foot. That was the accuracy there. Now, they would add buckshot into that ball that went in there. It was called buck and ball. So if you got 100 men with 100 muskets and they're loaded up with buck and ball, all of a sudden they got 500 projectiles coming at you. And this is why the British armies lined up in a line and fired in volleys. Because if individually firing, you weren't going to cause a lot of damage. But when everybody fired together in a volley at the same time, you maximized your firepower then. But while the British used that Brown Bess musket, their favorite weapon was the bayonet. And the bayonet was the most feared weapon on the battlefield. So when you fire your volley and you take out 10, 15% of the enemy, but you start charging with your bayonet, when you see 100 men charging straight at you with their bayonets leveled, there's not too many people can stand up to that. And that was a fierce fighting tool that the British had. In other words, that Brown Bess musket was really just regarded as a spear that could fire. And once that volley was fired, the spear came into effect. But there was a counteract to the musket. And there was another type of firearm on the battlefield. And this is the rifle. This is the hunting rifle that these backwoods countrymen used to shoot their deer and their squirrels and everything else. They realized that when you had a rifle barrel and you cut a groove in that barrel and caused that bullet to spin, you really increased the accuracy of your shot. And a hunting rifle was accurate up to 200 yards. So as far as snipers are concerned, you know, you could pick somebody off from 200 yards away, and that was very effective. But the rifles had disadvantages as well. It took 60 seconds to load and fire a rifle. And a rifle could not be fitted with the bayonet. And every time you fired that rifle, the black powder in that gun fouled. It made the barrel smaller and smaller and smaller. And you could only shoot a rifle 4 times in combat. And you had to use a smaller bullet every time. When you were going into, and they made their bullets out of molds and so forth, they would have 4 different sizes of molds, knowing which, you know, they're going to shoot when. But after 4 shots, if you didn't just call time out and take about 15 or 20 minutes to clean your rifle, you know, you just couldn't use it at all. Another effective weapon was the sword. And there were as many or even more casualties from swords and bayonets than there were from muskets. So that's part of the weaponry that's involved. And another thing to keep in mind as we're talking about how these battles evolved and everything was the difference in militia versus regular soldiers. In the Patriot forces, they had militiamen and they had Continental soldiers. The Continental soldiers signed up for about a 3-year period or the duration of the war. They were trained, they had uniforms from France. They usually fought with muskets, even though there were rifle companies. And they fought pretty much along the British model. But so much of the fighting in the South, and with our 3 fantastic South Carolina militia generals, Pickens, Sumter, and Marion, these men were militiamen. And militiamen were yeoman farmers who signed up for about 60 days at a time, and that was it. And some of these fellas signed up like 6 and 7 times, but it was for 60 days. They wouldn't sign up during fall harvest, and they wouldn't sign up during spring planting, but, you know, if you needed their help for a winter campaign or the middle of the summer, they were there, they would help you out. And they were very effective fighters. They weren't as effective in set-piece battle formations like what was happening in the North with Brandywine. There was like 15,000 on each side in Brandywine, and that was all, you know, European-style fighting. But when it came to the Indian tactics, and our South Carolina generals learned their tactics from the French and Indian War in the 1760s, they learned the Indian style of fighting, and that's what they utilized. And towards the end of the war, particularly with Nathaniel Greene, the commanding officers realized how they could absolutely best use the militia and the Continental Army together. Cowpens is a fantastic example of that. And that showed, you know, Daniel Morgan's true genius. So those are points that I wanted you to keep in mind as we continue the discussion throughout the history of the Revolutionary War in the backcountry of South Carolina in particular, and that's what we're going to be talking about from here on out. So I talked about how the Continental Divide was the proclamation line of 1763. When people and Pennsylvania was pretty well settled, and it got slammed right up against the Appalachian Mountains, and settlement could not progress further. And the only course of action was to come south. And this is the Great Wagon Road. In 1755, the Treaty of Saluda opened up the 96th district, right down in here. So the Wagoners, Daniel Morgan, old Wagoner, this is how settlement started coming down. North Carolina got filled in. South Carolina was getting filled in. This Great Wagon Road forded the Saluda River at Island Ford, where Robert Cunningham had his plantation house. And that's about right down in here. This line right down in here is currently the border between Laurens and Newberry counties. I don't know really, most counties are divided by, geographic lines from this coordinate to that coordinate, or rivers. I know of very few county lines that are defined by roadways, but the line between Laurens and Newberry is defined by what was the Great Wagon Trail right down in this area here. So that's how this became the frontier of America from 1755 to 1775, the 96th district. And well, here it is, the 96th district right here. And this is the town, the community, the hamlet of 96. And you can see the four westernmost counties in South Carolina were Indian Territory. Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties, there was illegal for any man of European descent to step foot in these counties unless they had a passport. And the British agents were the ones who gave the passports to the traders. Now, first shots in the backcountry of South Carolina. The British government, the colonial government, knew that there was trouble brewing. And as a matter of fact, early on, one of the first acts in South Carolina was when the royal governor, William Campbell, feared for his safety so much that he skedaddled over to a warship in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And so the Council of Safety then took over as the South Carolina government, Patriot government. And there was a whole series of forts bordering Oconee and the Cherokee territories and so forth. This is Fort Charlotte, which was on the Savannah River. There was a corresponding fort in Georgia called Fort James. Fort Charlotte kept the Creeks from coming into South Carolina. Fort James kept the Cherokees from going into Georgia. That was their theory. Fort Charlotte was built in the 1760s by Andrew Williamson, who was the Patriot general. He was the supervisor, the boss of Marion, Pickens, and Sumter originally. And he's the one who led the Cherokee War of 1776, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the British collected all of their arms and ammunition at Fort Charlotte. Fort Charlotte was built out of granite. It was the only fort that was built out of granite blocks, even though it was built on shifting sand and it had a bad foundation and it was in poor repair. But all the shot and all the powder was stored in Fort Charlotte, including 18 swivel guns. And a swivel gun was the only type of artillery that existed in the backcountry of South Carolina. And this was really a naval weapon. It was a little short cannon, is what it was. A man could pick it up and haul it around, and it was mounted on a spike. You'd set it in a log or something like that, and it had a U-bolt on it, so you could go up and down, you could go back and forth, you could aim it in the ship rigging or wherever you wanted to go. But you load that thing up with buckshot and then nails and glass, you did not want to charge a swivel gun. And that was the only artillery. 18 swivel guns and the shot and the powder were captured at Fort Charlotte. Let's see, I'm going to go to this one. This is the Cherokee Path. up here's where Kiowee was, and this was a path between the watershed for the Savannah River and the watershed for the Santee River, which went way up under here. Santee River is a big watershed. But this was a dry ridge running through the state of South Carolina. It goes all the way down into King Street in Charleston. This presently now is Interstate 26. So this was the route that the Cherokees would take their deer skins down to trade in Georgia, in Charleston. Except for, I don't see Kiowee Town. There's Kiowee right there. The British did put a fort in Kiowee, Fort Prince George, and that became a trading center as well. But early on, the Council of Safety wanted to curry the favor of the British forces. Now, one of the deals of the Treaty of Saluda was that the land, the 96th District, was bought from the Cherokees. This is one of the few, if not the only treaty that was actually honored by both sides. And the sale price for the 96th District was that 2,000 pounds of lead and 1,000 pounds of powder would be delivered every year to the Cherokees in Kiowee so that they could have their fall hunt. And then from their fall hunt, they would be able to provide deer skins for the British. So this was beneficial for both sides. Trade worked. But when the Council of Safety ran the British governor into that warship, they decided that they wanted to continue that arrangement by sending shot and powder to the Cherokees, and they sent a wagon train escorted by 24 men to towards Kiowee. Well, that brings us to the richest man in Lawrence County during this time, and this is Patrick Cunningham. And his brother, Robert Cunningham, I think was the second richest man in Lawrence County. And Robert and Patrick Cunningham were leading loyalists. Patrick Cunningham was a loyalist. Robert Cunningham, he was a Tory. But anyway, Robert Cunningham was the general of loyalist resistance. And the head Tory in the state of South Carolina came from Lawrence County. He lived on Peach Hill Plantation, which was at the Island Ford over the Saluda River. And the second leading loyalist in the state was his brother, Patrick Cunningham, who built this mansion right here. This mansion was started, it took 15 years to build this. Now, there was a little bit of an interruption called the Revolutionary War in between that. But he started this in the early 1700s. This is the first home in Lawrence County that was built with sawn lumber, with cut lumber. Every other building, structure, home in the county was log cabins. And it was log cabins with dirt floors. You know, that's how primitive it was. But Patrick Cunningham had 40 slaves, and again, he was a leading loyalist. And his brother, Robert Cunningham, was captured by the Council of Safety early on, and he was put in a dungeon in Charleston. And Patrick Cunningham didn't like that, so he gathered up a group of 200 of his friends. They headed down the Cherokee Path on the way to free his brother. Well, that was a pretty unrealistic undertaking. But as he was going down the Cherokee Path, he came upon the wagon train of shot and powder that the Council of Safety was sending to the Cherokees. And the next best thing to him was he captured that shot and powder. And told the Wagoneers and everything to get lost. He was going to keep that shot and powder for himself, or he was going to give it to the Cherokees, but whatever it was, he was going to control it. And so then he went to 96 and camped out there. And I told you earlier about Andrew Williamson, who was the Patriot general. And his plantation was in Greenwood County at a place called Whitehall. So we got the leading Tory from Lawrence County, leading Patriot from Greenwood County. The backcountry was absolutely divided. This was a civil war during this time. Andrew Williamson gathers a force of 450 Patriots and confronts Cunningham and his 200 Patriots there at 96. Well, the word goes out, the Loyalists converge, and they have 1,900 men. And this is just within a few weeks' time. 25 Wagoneers, 200 Loyalists under Cunningham, 450 Patriots under Williamson, and now we have 1,900 Loyalists surrounding and besieging Andrew Williamson's men. That's the Cherokee Path, by the way. That's the way it looks now. That's in 96. So Williamson fortifies Savage's farm, Savage's old field. This is at 96 too, but this is another fortification at 96, but it's similar to what Williamson had. They would use the outbuildings for defense and the fences, fence rows, and then they would fill in with a body or fence rails or whatever they needed to create a fort. So Williamson had a fort. He was besieged by the Loyalists. Well, the Council of Safety is not going to have any of that. They gather up an army of 4,000 men from the Camden district, and they march all the way to 96. Now we've got 4,000 Patriots in the field under Richard Richardson, and his second in command is Major Danger Thompson. So the Loyalists know Richardson's coming. Williamson and the Patriots don't know he's coming. And the Loyalists, particularly under the guidance of Richard Paris, who had, his plantation in downtown Greenville, they agree to a truce. And Paris's arrangement was that the Loyalists would retreat above the Saluda River and the Patriots would tear down their fort. Now, a two-day siege preceded this arrangement, and shots were fired against each other during this time. And James Birmingham, a Patriot militiaman, was killed during this time. James Birmingham was the first South Carolinian to die in the quest for freedom in South Carolina. So the arrangement is made, and the Loyalists go across the Saluda. Williamson tears his fort down. Richard Richardson comes up with his 4,000 men. And they say, oh, we made a truce, everybody's happy, we're going home. And Richard Richardson says, wait a minute, I didn't agree to any truce. Those terms do not apply to me whatsoever. So he started arresting the Loyalist leaders. He arrested Richard Paris. He arrested Thomas Fletchall. Many of the Loyalists at that time fled. They fled up into Cherokee territory. Patrick Cunningham fled, and he still has his 200 men and his shot and his powder. And Where does Patrick Cunningham flee to? He flees to the wildest, most remote area he can possibly think of, and that's in southern Greenville County on the banks of the Reedy River. And it's in the middle of a cane brake. And this here is a cane brake. And you can see how thick this vegetation is. Cane brakes were traditional defensive structures for the Native Americans. When you camp out in a cane brake, nobody can ever sneak up on you. The rustling leaves makes too much noise. So you always know somebody's coming. So that's where Patrick Cunningham was. And this is a plat that shows the cane brake in southern Greenville County, which is currently on the Hopkins plantation. And we've got a field trip planned for this spot Saturday morning. I'm going to tell you a little more about that, but I want everybody to join us there because these lectures, to me, are just setting the groundwork for the field trips that we take. And if you want to have fun with these lectures, you want to go to the field trips, because the field trips is where it's at. And I just try to set the background up for what we do with the field trips. But this is 1 square mile right here, 640 acres. This property was bought by Richard Wynn. Winnsboro, South Carolina is named after him and his family. He bought this property in 1785. And you can see outlined here is an area that's labeled as the Great Cane Brake. Great Cane Brake. Somewhere around here is where this battle was fought. This is the Reedy River. And you can still see the configuration of the Reedy River to this day follows this course. Now, the Hopkins family owns this part on the west bank of the Reedy. In 1876, they planted a grove. This is 100 years after the Revolution started. The Hopkins family has owned this property since 1834. They planted a grove of pecan trees on this property, and they call it Patriots Grove. And this is the site that they assume where the battle took place. We've had investigations of the site trying to find out exactly where the battle took place. It's in bottomland, it floods. We found an aluminum can 2 feet deep. So that's how much siltation has happened in the past 250 years. But Patrick Cunningham and his men were encamped down here in the cane brake. Now, this is December 22nd of 1775, and it is cold. It is bitter cold. Cunningham's men were burning the cane, and when the cane burns, it's got chambers. Those chambers get hot and they swell and they pop and they sound like rifle fire going off. So Danger Thompson, who was leading the raid against the cane brake, he could hear the fires going off. He could see the fires burning in the distance. And he had 1,300 men that he was leading in a column to surround the cane brake. Richard Richardson took his army of 4,000 men and settled down at Hollingsworth Mill on Raven Creek. Many of y'all know where that is. It's where Dirty Creek goes into Raven Creek. It's where Ecom Bridge Road intersects with Fort Lindley Road. So there's 4,000 men there at Hollingsworth Mill. There's never been an army that big in western South Carolina, ever. And the biggest army ever in South Carolina was when Sherman came through. But these 4,000 men, there was never 4,000 combined. Utah Springs had almost 4,000. This was the biggest army in South Carolina, and it's in December of 1775. Richardson gets word of where Cunningham is, and he sends Danger Thompson overnight up the banks of the Reedy, about 30 miles away. They cover that distance in the dead of night in bitter, bitter cold. And they almost get completely around the battle of the encampment of Cunningham there. Shots ring out. There's 4 or 5 loyalists that were killed at that time. There was one Patriot casualty, a Lieutenant Polk, the cousin of James K. Polk. He was wounded in the shoulder, a 17-year-old lieutenant from North Carolina. 750 of these 1,300 men were from North Carolina. And the reason is the guys from North Carolina, they had horses. So, you know, they went on this mission surrounding the Battle of the Canebrake. 130 men were captured. 70 of them got away. And they probably went up the Reedy River. And they went further into Cherokee territory. Patrick Cunningham got away. David Fanning got away. He was a leading Tory. He was a 19-year-old sergeant during this battle. Later on, he led a 900-man regiment in North Carolina who captured the governor of North Carolina and marched him down to Wilmington, fighting the whole way. David Fanning was a hell of a fighter, and if he had been a patriot, the war would have been over two years earlier. But he was from Lawrence County. So there were some significant fighting men that did come from Lawrence County. So as soon as the battle was over, and it lasted about 15 minutes, the 130 Loyalist prisoners had their arms tied behind their backs. And at that point, it started to snow. And it snowed then like we have really never seen snow since. Some accounts call for it to be 18 inches high. Others say 30 inches high. And it snowed for 30 hours. And these men are being marched down to Charleston. And many of them were barefoot. There were bloody footprints in the snow. And the last hour and a half of that gruesome ordeal was blinding sleet, the worst of all. So those men were marched down to Charleston, and they stayed for several months in jails down there, and they were given their parole in April, and they were let loose in April of 1776. So this is what Patriots Grove looks like now. These are the pecan trees that were planted in 1876. These pecan trees are 145 years old. And most of them are gone, but there are a few standing there. One thing I've done with my battlefield preservation is plant rows on the outside of these existing rows, so that 145 years from now, perhaps we will have a Patriots Grove will still be in existence. That's the summertime view. That's what it's going to look like when we're there on Saturday. And this shows the pecans that we planted. And I didn't use this picture for Lomax's smiling face. I used it for this pecan right there. And I ate that pecan. And it was delicious. So that's the start of the Revolutionary War in the backcountry of South Carolina. The snow campaign is the end of the initial beginning of that.